Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you to Playing with Fear, Monsters, Myths, and Mayhem, presented by the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. This event is part of our Dark Reflections, a scholarly series focusing on horror, folklore, death, and the macabre, featuring faculty and associate faculty from the College of Liberal Arts. I'm Megan Mell, Director of Alumni Experiences in the College of Liberal Arts, and I will be your host for today's presentation and the entire Dark Reflections series. So thank you all for joining us this Halloween week as we get into the spooky spirit of the season. Throughout today's conversation, I encourage you to submit a question or a comment or reaction for our presenter to address in the second portion of the event. To do this, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter in your question. This event is being recorded and will be shared out with all registered participants and will also be available on the Playing with Fear website as well. Today's presenter is Dr. Peter Harle. Dr. Harle is a core member of the Religious Studies program at the University of Minnesota and serves as the undergraduate advisor for the departments of anthropology, art history, and philosophy. He has taught a wide range of courses on folklore, religion, foodways, mythology, and traditional arts. Dr. Harle's research has centered on the overlap between lived religion and material artistry, ranging from food offerings and celebratory meals to cemetery art, home altars, restaurant and grocery shrines, and divination games. He also serves as a board member for Grassroots Culture Minnesota, an organization that promotes and documents arts, folklore, and folk life from many traditional cultures in Minnesota. Today, Dr. Harle asks, why do we find it so entertaining to intentionally scare ourselves? He will explore Halloween haunted houses, divination games, legend trips, cryptid tourism, monster parades, and all sorts of other forms of creepy fun. So Dr. Harle, thank you so much for joining us, and I invite you to begin today's presentation.
Fantastic. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. As kind of came up in the introduction, I am a folklorist by training. We are interested in things that have some time depth, things that are passed down person to person, things that are creatively and skillfully shaped by the individuals within a tradition, and in the people who pass these things down, how they transform them to fit changing contexts. And what about these things gives them enough relevance and meaning to keep them in circulation? Now, I teach a first-year seminar here called Witches, Ghosts, and Evil Clowns, Figures of Fear in Art, Folklore, and Popular Culture. And I think that's what caught the attention of the organizers of this series. I'm not going to attempt to boil down everything from that entire course into a single talk. Instead, today I'm going to focus a bit on the fear part, but then mostly center things on the fun side of stuff that's otherwise eerie or horrifying, and on some of the things that make this stuff compelling. I want to start out, though, with some questions for you. So let's pull up a poll here. Can we do the fear response poll? You want to take a little time to just give your response on this? What are some of the physical responses that you associate with fear? How do our bodies react to scary images or situations? Share anything that you can think of in connection with that. A few more seconds. Great. Let's see what we got here. And Megan, can you share some of the results from that?
I sure can. Let's see. A number of people have written in goosebumps, closed eyes, startle reflex, screams, heart pounding, speeding heartbeat, blood rushing in ears, a lot of increased heart rate, speechlessness, freezing in place, Um, Screaming, running, fight or flight response, stomach clenches, breath catches, um, a number of goosebumps, and all sorts of sweaty palms, sweating in general, tingles in my scalp, feeling jumpy. And then a few more are hot and cold flashes, adrenaline, heart pounding, roaring in the ears.
Fantastic. So yeah, all of these incredible kinds of sensations go along with being afraid. And we have this deep kind of primal reaction that happens when we encounter these things. Fear can be an intense stimulant as our brains prepare for this fighting or fleeing or freezing. So keep all of that in mind as you think about the appeal of intentionally playing with scary things. There's a kind of overlay that comes from that to whatever else is going on. I want to do one other poll before I get into doing some slides here, but let's switch to the one about the kinds of figures of fear, characters, creatures. Okay, take about a minute on this one. What kinds of traditional characters or creatures have made people afraid? What are some of the ones that stand out for you? Any favorites that you have? We'll give it just a few more seconds here. All right. So Megan, what do we have in this one?
All right. So this one we have Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, ghosts, vampires, snakes, Jack Nicholson in The Shining. A bit of a non-traditional answer. Vampires, werewolves, witches, Sasquatch, and then we have a few characters from movies: Jason, Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger. We did have one person who also added politicians, so another non-traditional character, perhaps. Mummies, zombies, dolls. I will second that one. Ghosts and demons, Dracula, Frankenstein. And we've also got serial killers as a general category there. The Headless Horseman, poltergeists, all the supernatural beings, shapeshifters, a few more characters: Pennywise, Jigsaw, The Thing, Ghostface. Yeah, and then I think a lot of the more traditional ones, vampires, ghost schools, are a lot of our audience are listing these as those traditional characters or creatures that have made people afraid.
Fantastic. And this is, I mean, this is a similar sort of mix that we see when we look at some of the characters that get worked into Halloween costumes, Halloween haunts, the whole host of it. Yes, you've got the traditional ones. You've got witches, ghosts, a host of different monsters, but serial killers, mad killers, and their most recent manifestations, and their literary versions, and their film versions definitely pop up all over the place. And even the politicians. I mean, politicians are traditionally a part of all kinds of costumes, whether it's Halloween or, way before then, carnival type costumes, a very popular kind of scary character out there. Okay, I'm gonna share PowerPoint here. Let's make sure this is working right. Is that showing up here?
Looks good.
All right, terrific. So here we go. Fear and the sense of fear and different figures of fear. Where do our monsters come from? Some scholars have speculated that these might trace back to days when there were more huge animals around for humans to encounter, or perhaps people found dinosaur bones and thought, oh, this might reasonably be assumed to be from giants or dragons. And, those kinds of things account for some of the bigger monsters that we've created. But many of the scary beings that inhabit our stories and our nightmares seem much more like ourselves. Uh, for example, folklorist Alan Dundas, in a piece composed for a collection he compiled of studies of vampires, made an interesting case for the roots of these scary bloodsuckers. Now, Dundas was unapologetically Freudian in his approach in a way that frequently clashes with more contemporary perspectives, but he had a knack for pointing out interesting kinds of associations. So, in accounts that we have of folk traditions of vampires, largely from Eastern Europe, from the Balkans, from Greece, the returning dead most commonly attack their own living relatives. When exhuming a body, because there's some sort of vampire panic going on, when you exhumed a body to see if it was in fact a vampire, people frequently looked for signs that a corpse displayed the liquid, moist qualities of the living rather than the dryness, the desiccation of death. So Dundas argued that we see a weird reversal of roles here, a kind of unholy flip. In the normal order of things, newborn humans draw life from their mothers and suck milk from their bodies. Vampires, unable to sustain themselves through normal food, seek out and suck the blood from the bodies of their living family, bringing sickness and death in the process. In other words, vampires make sense to us and terrify us because they take something that we do naturally and they reverse it. So that's pretty classic Freudian stuff. But it can be interesting to look for similar reversals, similar kinds of reflections in some other figures of fear. So, among the stories and the images of witches in European tradition, we see earthbound figures who fly, youthful women with strange power who tempt men into perversion and crime, and the hags depicted as withered, unable to bear children, instead stealing them from others. So women using body parts and other creepy ingredients to cook up things other than conventional feasts, things like hailstorms. Now, around the same time, as the accounts of travelers to the Americas circulated in Europe, people there became somewhat obsessed with the theme of cannibalism, to the point where the word cannibal or tiny images of people munching on human limbs became a kind of shorthand for the region of the parts of the Americas in books and on maps. You just see cannibal down there. And by the way, you can see some striking examples of this at the James Ford Bell Library here on campus. They have some amazing ones in their collection. In prints of cannibal picnics, for example, this one, we see a horrible reversal in which humans, who we usually identify with as eaters, also become the eaten. We see platters and bowls and grills in some of these, familiar elements from everyday meals and special feasts, and here they're associated with recognizably human bits. In the 19th and 20th century, in countries that had grown prosperous through colonialism, through sending people with guns out on ships to claim riches, land, and to enslave people in unfamiliar places, we find stories of alien invaders firing up the imagination of the public. So, beings from other lands, unfamiliar beings coming in doing pretty much the same sort of stuff, causing destruction, enslaving, coming in unfamiliar craft with weird weapons. So, oddly familiar stuff. Our figures of fear often resemble us in strange ways. Okay, another note on here. Zombies. Zombies first captured the attention of the American public in the 1920s, at a time when the US occupation of the island nation of Haiti was underway. The zombie was a relatively minor element of Haitian folk tradition, one with distinctive roots in the experience of slavery and colonialism. And in early accounts, zombies were people who had been magically subdued or drugged to appear dead, and then unearthed and revived after burial and forced to work on secret plantations. In other words, literally robbed of their connections to their lives, taken away, and used to profit from their bodily labor. Pretty resonant with slavery. At a time when many US servicemen were stationed in Haiti, William Seabrook's book, The Magic Island, which this was drawn from, this illustration here, introduced the idea of zombies to Americans in a particularly sensationalized way. So Seabrook talked about Haitian religion filled with frenzied dancing and fire and sacrifices. A lot of the stuff that's become the kind of lazy visual shorthand for thinking about religion in Haiti in a lot of American popular culture. And this became fuel for films like White Zombie and I Walked with a Zombie. So really kind of entrenched this in the American popular consciousness as a kind of character. Zombies were horrifying, but in many ways they embodied the horrors of slavery. And even decades later, when zombies were radically reconceived by George Romero in Night of the Living Dead, they still were unsettling reflections of ourselves. In this case, the dead seem to have been reanimated by radiation from a failed space probe, producing shuffling hordes of literal mindless consumers. Now, if that seems flippant, remember the first sequel actually takes place in a mall. So yeah, these were just shuffling, eating, endlessly hungry. And on top of that, in this initial movie, especially, Romero made the living almost as scary as the returning dead, as the characters in there fell victim to each other's biases, each other's cowardice, and selfishness. Now, at least as far back as ancient Greece and Rome, monstrous births and half-human creatures were often attributed to people's uncontrolled lustful activities, or to dabbling in magic, or defying the gods. That theme lived on and still lives on in many ways. Even folklore surrounding one of our domestic monsters, the Jersey Devil, blames humans for its origin. Mother Leeds, who lived in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey, supposedly had 12 children, and on discovering that she was pregnant again, cursed her unborn child, calling it the devil. Bad mistake. She gave birth to the baby. It sprouted wings, a forked tail, head of a goat, hooves. It attacked the family, disappeared up the chimney, and vanished into the woods. And then continued to show up intermittently and traumatize people and attack carriages and that sort of thing. So the Jersey Devil got established that way. Marina Warner, in her fascinating book, No Go the Boogeyman, highlights another possible origin point for some of our monsters, family dynamics. Parents around the world, weary of the everyday effort of getting kids to behave, often resort to boogeymen of various sorts. So if you don't shut up and go to sleep, insert creature name here, will carry you off and eat you. If you keep wandering off, they will get you. Just kind of handy to have an outside enforcer of some sort. This intertwines with the fates of so many children in fairy tales, children who ignore the warnings of their parents and they wind up in peril at the hands of various treacherous and monstrous beings. It also, as Warner pointed out, weaves in tightly with racism and xenophobia because the boogeymen used to control children were so often identified as particular others, particular marginalized people in the community, fostering some early and deep entrenched prejudices. But Warner also notes that many of the distinctive characteristics of certain scary monsters echo widespread family experiences. For example, we all at some point, having grown from being very small, have shared the experience of being surrounded by much larger, much more powerful beings. Ones with weirdly deep voices who were able to pick us up at will, who wanted to control us, who had all sorts of odd behaviors and rules that made no sense to us. Weird, withered beings who seemed obsessed with poking and pinching us and who exclaimed delightedly that they could just eat us up. And on the flip side, parents and older siblings living with screaming, endlessly needy little ones might recognize many aspects of changelings or of the disturbingly controlling children with weird powers who sometimes haunt our nightmares. So whether these are Freudian projective inversions, unsettling reflections of our own worst characteristics, a kind of karmic consequence of our own action, or literal extensions of our own family, there's often something innate to our monsters that makes them both terrifying and at the same time relatable, even at times endearing. Aw, it's Gossamer. There he is. What a great guy. All right, now let's turn to some of the ways in which we have fun with fear. And I want to do another poll here if we could. Let's do the which of the following poll. So, uh, out of these, it's multiple choice. You can pick as many as you want. Which of the following have you done? Have you visited a Halloween haunt, worn a costume of a scary character, participated in a ghost tour, owned a toy based on a monster, ghost, or witch, visited a particular place because of its alleged association with a strange being or supernatural event, taken part in a horror fan event, a cryptid festival, or a similar gathering. And again, we'll give that about a minute, see where we're going on there. Haunts and costumes, very big here. Definitely leading the way. Okay, let's wrap that one up. All right, so there are our results. Kind of neat. Ghost tour is pretty popular. Clearly, the monster toys are a big thing out there. Not as much on the horror fan events, cryptid festivals, or similar gatherings. So, they're a relatively popular thing, but they're still kind of their own subset of society in many ways. A lot of these other ones are pretty widespread. So great. In talking about the fun side of stuff, let's start with two big genres of oral folklore. Märchen, that's the name that derives from the work of the Brothers Grimm that is widely used in folklore studies to talk about magic tales or what we might think of as fairy tales, though that's often more of the literary genre in there. So we'll talk a little bit about that and we'll talk about legends. Magic tales, as many folklorists have characterized them, are typically told for entertainment, though often with elements of instruction or social control in the mix. So there's a hidden subtext to here, or a not so hidden message to it. They're understood as fictional. Okay, these are things that are a fantastic tale and told that way. They're set in realms far away in time and space, so long ago and far away, once upon a time. They're often highly stylized. So you'll see pattern numbers showing up. There were three sisters. There were three of these. There were that kind of thing. You see repetition. Two characters fail at something and the third succeeds. You see formulaic patterning of words. Fee, fi, fo, fum. Certain characters have identifiable ways of talking that come through. Verbal framings. Okay, again, that once upon a time is a classic one. You know what you're hearing when you hear that phrase. Uh, Characters that are almost abstract extremes. So incredibly evil villains, incredibly pure in heart characters, absurdly clumsy or stupid characters. And even the visual and material elements of Magic Tales are almost abstracted. So things are metallic or in rich jewel tones, castles of ice, seas of fire, that kind of thing. It's really marked as something very different and remarkable. The scary figures in Magic Tales are exciting, in part because of the role their looming threat and treachery play in the narrative. They also have a way of lurking in disguise, seeming to be kindly old women, friendly animals, otherwise non-threatening spouses or romantic partners with just a few weird habits. Um, Legends, however, are a different matter. Let's go this one here. Uh, Here's La Llorona. Uh, while we sometimes tell legends for fun, legends are set in the everyday world. They're closely intertwined with our reality. Many scholars used to describe legends as belief stories, but that has some issues. As the folklorist Linda Degg and some others pointed out, one doesn't have to believe a legend in order to spread it. In fact, it's entirely possible for a skeptic or an active debunker to have learned about a particular legend from a true believer or from someone who is actively trying to stamp out the legend to wind up inadvertently introducing it to someone who'll believe it. Why are there so many people freaking out about this Pizzagate thing? Maybe there's something they're trying to cover up. Legends often get spread in conversations with multiple people telling pieces of them and sometimes disagreeing about the specifics, so it's less like you're sitting down and listening to a single teller. In a sense, they're more like debates about truth than they are belief tales. Legends are anchored in the everyday, but they tend to be memorable because of supernatural factors or incredibly out of the ordinary, horrifying, or embarrassing incidents. These are the parts that stick. In fact, legends tend to drift and get re anchored, relocalized in different settings. So, the vanishing hitchhiker. The vanishing hitchhiker shows up in Chicago, in North Carolina, in Manitoba, in Dublin. Here's the cemetery that's played a part in dozens of Chicago versions. The variety of this variation is often called Resurrection Mary after Resurrection Cemetery. Sometimes these hitchhikers give a friendly warning or make a prediction about world events. Sometimes they give an address or they leave a sweater behind. They may get recognized by the driver as they try to track them down, by a name on a gravestone, a portrait in a convent office, a bartender who's heard the same story from many other drivers in these parts. The parts of the legend that stick, though, are the elements that suggest a brush with a dead person in the otherwise everyday act of helping a stranded traveler. In other words, this is just this is the glue. This is the glue that kind of holds a legend together, makes it memorable, and stays around even if it gets transplanted. In other legends, these sorts of elements might be a clock that stops or a fancy cup that cracks at the moment of a loved one's death far away. A strange creature that's spotted from time to time, often right before a particularly dangerous event. Or even the awkward, funny inversion of something like the blow-dried bunny. So, one of my grandfather's friends lived next to a family that kept a fluffy white bunny as a pet and often let it play outside in a pen. And one day, the friend's dog came home with the bunny dead in its jaws. Friend was upset, didn't want the family to blame the dog, so he carefully washed the blood from the bunny's fur, fluffed it up with a hair dryer, quietly crept into their backyard, and put the bunny back into its pen. A few days later, he ran into the neighbor who said, "The weirdest thing happened this week. Our bunny died and we buried it in the backyard. The next day it reappeared, still dead, but just as clean and fluffy as it was when it was alive." So even in the funny ones, there's still that weird element. There's still something unsettling. There's still something that sticks with you. Folklorist Bill Ellis, paraphrasing Linda Degg, writes that we tend to assume that the world is a rational, predictable place. But of course, the legend insists that it isn't. Another quote from Linda Degg was, "If humans are visitors in the world of the Martian, the legend is an illegal alien on Earth, a malicious and heartless intruder." But this very testing of the boundaries of reality is exciting. Legends reawaken a sense of wonder, of the weird, of unexpected possibilities. One closely connected area of folklore is the legend trip, where narrative intersects with a ritual of sorts. Legend trips are mostly, but not exclusively, associated with adolescence. When we're pushing the boundaries of our childhood, when we're getting over some of our fears, and when we're rebelling against adult restrictions. In southern Indiana, the town of Tunnelton is named for several local railroad tunnels that were completed a few years before its founding. The big tunnel runs over 1,700 feet, far enough underground that much of its length is fairly dark, even in the daytime. Local legends have circulated for many years about a man who was killed by a passing truck or an entire family whose wagon was struck by a train. Many people claim to have seen a lantern moving through the passage at night, or a shadowy figure with his decapitated head under his arm. Growing up there, hearing various accounts of the tunnel, many teens venture out there at night to see what they'll encounter. So, legend trips typically include a cluster of legend variants that people have heard, a traditional action or set of actions. Well, if you venture out there, you'll see X. And people's individual stories about what happened when they tried this. So that abandoned hospital, that weird grave marker, that creepy statue, that tunnel. When we test a legend firsthand, we are, in a sense, retelling it through action. It can be terrifying and exhilarating, but it leaves us with our own stories, ones which might affirm or debunk or might veer off into a funny or weird thing that happened along the way. So we're folded into the narrative. Adults are a little more likely to participate in more organized commercial versions of this. Things like ghost tours or staying at an allegedly haunted hotel. People enjoy these things so much that it's become a significant part of tourism. Older cities like Charleston or New Orleans are filled with opportunities like this. Salem, Massachusetts, with its infamous history of witch trials, is now home to a wide range of year-round witch tours, museums, shops, peaking each year with vast crowds during the Halloween holiday season. The US has also seen a big upswing in interest in cryptids. And we have one more poll on this one. Let's do the cryptid poll here. Which of these cryptids do you find most interesting or appealing? The hodag, mothman, chessie, skunk ape, chupacabra, the Loveland frog, the Jersey devil, or what's a cryptid? So again, we'll give this about a minute. Right, so we seem to be shaping up with, I think, Mothman in the lead, followed by the Chupacabra, both well-known ones out there. A few votes each for some of these others in the mix, and then a good number with what's a cryptid. So let's get into that. What is a cryptid? Uh, pull into here. All right. Cryptids are weird, legendary, local creatures. They are, the crypt part is hidden, cryptic. Uh, a lot of this comes from a few key ones early on. So, the Loch Ness Monster, for example, Bigfoot. The term is also sometimes used for certain animals that have actually been found. So, coelacanths, for example, where they were thought to be fossils, and lo and behold, they find a living one. It kind of gives hope for all the people who are looking for the weird reported monsters out there that may not have been fully documented beyond something blurry or a scattered account. But there's a lot of love for these creatures, and it's really been on the upswing lately, pretty dramatically. Some of these weird, legendary local creatures are derived from the traditions of various Native American communities. Some are transplants, variations on well-known monsters from other parts of the world. Some are more recent in origin, based on 20th century sightings, or were created for fun by taxidermists, like the jackalope, which is the bunny that has horns to it. Uh, Longtime favorites, here we go. Longtime favorites like the Sasquatch, the Rougarou, and the Jersey Devil have been joined by Mothman, the Hodag, the Squonk, and many others. Many places have embraced their local cryptids, creating themed businesses, erecting statues and other selfie bait, and holding festivals. And you can even find cryptid-themed games, reinforcing a kind of shared identity among these diverse legendary creatures. Now, this has an interesting parallel in a much older tradition in Japan, where a proliferation of strange creatures known as yokai have been described, depicted, and since the Edo period, collected and cataloged. Here's one of the classic early ways of depicting yokai. The night parade of 100 Oni. Oni are kind of particularly scary variety or dangerous variety of yokai. In the Heian period, government diviners would periodically issue warnings that a procession of dangerous yokai was expected to move through Kyoto on a given night. Travelers also sometimes reported seeing similar processions in rural areas, but even glimpsing such a procession was potentially fatal. You can see from these illustrations that they're simultaneously kind of terrifying and fun from pretty early on. As folklorist Michael Dillon Foster has recounted, illustrated collections of yokai became enormously popular, and from very early in their history, they included both figures from rural folk traditions and new, intentionally created yokai. These images and the stories are both eerie and playful. Foster notes that many seem to emerge from an odd phenomenon, say the experience of stopping for the night while traveling, finding an abandoned house that you can seek shelter in, and feeling while you're staying there like you're being watched. Or the tendency of temple lanterns to occasionally go out without an obvious gust of wind. A yokai offers a name, an explanation, and a memorable character. Some yokai look much like we might expect a monster to look. Others take the form of familiar animals but have powers far beyond the expected. And still others take the form of everyday objects. So you'll see a parasol repeatedly showing up as one of the yokai. In fact, there's an understanding that once objects get to be about a century or more old, they have potential to become yokai in their own right. So yokai continue to be a source of fascination. They're at the heart of some of the most popular anime and manga and games, such as, for example, the countless versions of Pokemon out there. Pocket Monsters, very much the notion of finding and collecting these monsters out there. And the way they're displayed has really, really strong echoes of these traditional depictions of yokai. There's an entire series, Yokai Watch, Demon Slayer, which spawned a movie that became the most popular movie in the world one year. Actually, demon is kind of a poor translation. It basically should be oni. It should be a variety of yokai. And so this character is going out and slaying these sinister yokai. And then some of the best known films by Studio Ghibli. All of these draw on yokai in various ways and take some very strong inspiration from them. Now, in the in-person settings, in 2005, a group started a festival in Kyoto based on the night parade of 100 Oni. It's become so popular that this year it's actually been moved to a much larger location post-pandemic because it was getting so crowded in its smaller area. So now it's actually stretching over months and including large displays and big parades of people in yokai costumes on multiple nights. People can actually sign up to be one of the costumed folks to go out on a given night. Monster parades are great fun. Monster parades are popular in a good number of places around the world. Uh, in Austria, costume performers on Krampusnacht walk through the streets portraying Krampus, Santa's terrifying child-stealing companion. In Bali, villages build ogo ogo, which are paraded through town before being burned, symbolizing a purification from evil forces the day before a holiday that's a day of silence and quiet. But since it's almost Halloween, let's not leave out some of the many traditions associated with this holiday. Halloween, like many associated festivals of death and life, takes place as the last of the summer's trees and leaves are fading, as the days get shorter and the shadows seem deeper. And since at least the 19th century, Halloween imagery has been filled with spooky creatures. Children and adults dressed in costumes, stepping out of their everyday identities. These costumes are sometimes cute, silly, or in questionable taste, but they're often scary too. And it can be fun to temporarily take on the role of a character that may have once scared you. Like the legend trips we talked about earlier, costumes can be a kind of bodily storytelling. A few monsters from folklore may make their way into the mix, but most come from popular culture. For example, in 1923, Universal Pictures, which had previously released a couple of less successful horror films, had a smash hit with The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and this led them to focus heavily on the genre for the next few decades, with The Phantom of the Opera, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Bride of Frankenstein, The Wolfman, and many others. And while kids were certainly part of the original audiences, most of these were made with adults in mind. However, in the 1950s, as TV stations scrambled for content, older monster movies were rerun and monster horror shows became regional staples. There's Vampira and Zachary and Ghoulardi, three of the classic hosts of these sorts of monster movie shows. Toy manufacturers realized that many kids loved monsters. By the 1960s, monsters, witches, and ghosts became beloved characters in TV comedies. Bewitched, Addams Family, The Munsters, and others. And iconic film monsters became part of the Halloween costume repertoire. So much as costumes offer a way to temporarily be a spooky character, spook houses and other Halloween haunts immerse viewers in stories and worlds that might otherwise feel more distant. A more effectively scary haunt can raise your pulse, make you jump and scream, disorient you, and maybe, for at least a second or two, let go of your reassuring conviction that the creepy things around you aren't real. The anthropologist Gregory Bateson had a great quote about this kind of play. A more complex form of play, the game which is constructed not upon the premise, this is play, but rather around the question, is this play? Is this play? So some of this plays with that very notion of, is this play? Another Halloween tradition along these lines, divination games. So prior to the 1940s, these often took the form of traditional ways in which young women might get a hint about the identity of a future spouse or other clues as to what sort of life lay ahead. Peeling an entire apple in one long strip, then tossing it over a shoulder and looking for initials in the pattern it made, or looking deep into a smoke-dimmed mirror, dropping candle wax into water and interpreting the shapes it made. The rise of the spiritualist movement opened up some new possibilities. So a little side story here. This is the Fox family cabin in Hydesville, New York. Um, Once there were three sisters who lived with their family in a house that some people said was haunted. In 1848, the girls began to complain that they heard weird noises at night, thumps and creaking floors and the sounds of dragging furniture. And finally, one of the girls, Kate, decided to talk to whatever was making the noise. She challenged it to imitate the snapping of her fingers. The girls began to ask questions, and they said to receive responses in the form of rapping noises. The family called in some of their friends, radical Quakers, by the way, and everyone was fascinated by what they heard. And over several days, they developed a code for spelling out words through thumps and began what appeared to be a lively conversation with a spirit. Now, Hydesville was in the burned over district of upstate New York. This was an area that had nurtured and sparked numerous new religions, utopian movements, and progressive social causes. And this process of rapid communication became a sensation there. And soon others were reporting successful attempts at spirit communication. Spiritualism, as this phenomenon was soon termed, became popular throughout the country. Many towns of moderate size had at least one circle. People experimented with other techniques, receiving messages through automatic writing and through mediums who would channel spirits while in trances. And from the beginning, spiritualism attracted both great excitement and skepticism. Many people found in it a more rational way of approaching the afterlife through systematic experimentation and concrete evidence, rather than the beliefs and dogma of established religions. Spirit messages often gave voice to perspectives that challenged entrenched ideas about gender and race and political authority. And anyone could try spiritualism without the need to adhere to someone else's rules and power structures. Some engaged in it with a serious sense of purpose, others participated for fun and entertainment, still others found it a great way to make some money off of people. And anyway, spiritualists developed all sorts of tools meant to facilitate spirit communications. One of these was a planchette, a little piece of wood with a pencil mounted in it that could glide around. So you could, in the hands of a medium or just a trained person, could glide fairly easily and write messages or draw images. And in 1890, Elijah Bond, a Baltimore businessman, patented a design for a talking board, one that predated him as a tool used by spiritualists since at least 5 years earlier. But he was the one who kind of formalized it and patented it. And in 1901, one of his employees, William Fuld, took over the production and named the board Ouija. Fuld marketed the Ouija board in contradictory language from the very beginning, fun and entertaining, a mysterious oracle. All the box itself told you that from very early on. Numerous ripoffs and creative permutations of the board were produced as these got tremendously popular. Here's the Yogi board, the Father Time board, the Magic Marvel board, the Yes Yes board, loads and loads of these. If you go to the Museum of Talking Boards or the Talking Board Historical Society online, you can see many, many examples. The Ouija craze was featured on a 1920 cover of the Saturday Evening Post by Norman Rockwell. So here's the kind of flirtation going on in the course of it as well. All sorts of interesting dynamics in this image. But clearly, these kinds of themes were still part of the appeal when Parker Brothers took over production in the 1960s. Oh, Ouija, can we take the car? Shall I become a model or fashion designer? What college will accept me? Who's Debbie's date for the prom? Funny how a boy seems to make the best partner. And the success of Ouija and its knockoffs helped open the way for a host of other mass-produced divination games. However, here's some of the favorite ones in the mass-produced ones. This is the great 60s era Mystique series, which included a palmistry set, a tarot set, an astrology set, all in great kind of psychedelic graphics, kind of Peter Maxey looking, and the classic Kabbalah by Transogram, which was a glow-in-the-dark board that tilted around and had a marble that rolled around with miniature tarot cards and a glowing eye that would follow the ball around. So it was a great, creepy, very strange game in there. But out of all of these, Ouija boards definitely have been subject to the most virulent attacks. This may be in part because of the ways in which they were often marketed, but the boards can also inspire this kind of thing because they're generative. That is, they have open-ended possibilities. And the messages that they produce imply a speaker of some sort somewhere out there. And that's somehow far more threatening than, say, a magic 8-ball. As a result, Ouija boards are sometimes treated as sinister things with agency, almost monsters in their own right, which has helped to make them a part of the iconography of Halloween. Here's Target's wooden Halloween tray from this season, avoiding any copyright issues with Parker Brothers. So today, Ouija boards and other mass-produced divination games are also intertwined with Halloween. And again, these hold the potential for eerie entertainment. For Bateson's Is This Play? So let's bring this around again. Witches, ghosts, monsters, and other sinister figures can affect us on a bodily level. Fear is troubling and triggers many innate responses. But fear intentionally employed can make a story, an image, an event, or a human-made environment intense, exciting, and fun. We've come up with a host of these characters, many of whom invert our ideas of good behavior or mirror our own faults and crimes. And we find fodder for our monsters in our history, in the uncertain developments of our present, and in neglected corners of our everyday world. But sometimes monsters might even be our friends. And I'll leave off with that. I wish you all a fun and spooky Halloween, and I thank you for your time. And I think we're opening stuff up to questions here.
Yes, we are. Thank you so much, Dr. Harle. This has been a really fun adventure going through history and all the different legends and monsters. And I know I've seen a few questions come through the Q&A button. So just a reminder to our audience, feel free to submit questions, comments, any reactions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we will try to get through as many questions as we have time for. Dr. Harle, do you want to take a few of these questions to start off with?
Sure, sure. Any personal encounters with a cryptid? Oh, as a kid, I really wanted to. I definitely wanted to. I grew up by the Chesapeake Bay, and at that point, Chessie was pretty widely talked about. Now, part of that was that the local environmental organization had actually adopted Chessie as a mascot to try to encourage conservation. And so Chessie was showing up on lots of stuff out there, but I kept being convinced that one of these days I was going to see it out there in the water. Legend that you've seen show up in different tellings in pop culture over and over. Oh boy, so many different ones of those. I think we see certainly, I mean, The Vanishing Hitchhiker is a classic one who shows up. The Hook definitely shows up repeatedly in there. Uh, Lots of variations on some of the awkward legends pop up in variations as just humorous incidents in movies. Not at all unusual for people to mind that. I think my favorite appearance of the Vanishing Hitchhiker is in the movie Pee-wee's Big Adventure with the trucker Large Marge coming by, and a particularly spooky incident. Can you recommend any folklore horror books? Uh, I think, one of the most chilling, but not in a conventional sense, folklore horror books that's out there. There's a book by David Hufford that's called The Terror That Comes in the Night, and he's actually writing about sleep paralysis experiences. But what happened with him was he went to Newfoundland and was teaching there. He was somebody who was both trained as a folklorist and as a doctor of medicine, and he wound up discovering that people in Newfoundland casually in a bar would say things like, "Oh, I had the old hag last night." Well, what the old hag meant was, I had the experience of laying in bed and having this mysterious and horrifying creature climb on top of me and crush the breath out of me, and I couldn't move, and it was really awful. But familiar enough in everyday conversation and in traditions of Newfoundland that people could just say, "Yeah, the old hag." Well, Hufford had himself had a similar experience that he'd never told anybody about years before, and that really threw him. And so when he started doing all sorts of stuff to try to use tools from medicine to say what seemed to be some of the features of this experience, what's coming up in here. And then after he got back into the States, he was on the faculty of a school of medicine and decided, I'm going to try the same kind of questionnaire with a group of medical students in a culture that really doesn't talk about this sort of thing or have a name for it. And he found a very similar percentage of people reporting the same kinds of symptoms. And ultimately, through a roundabout way, that kind of got to the notion of, hey, this seems to be something that's really widespread. It seems to be something that has an association with certain kinds of sleep paralysis and apnea in there. But reading through the book itself, reading through people's direct firsthand encounters and their own expressions of what they had gone through is really chilling. So that's a particularly spooky one. What initially sparked your interest in these topics and unexplained phenomena? Um, when I was a little kid, I had a stretch of time where almost every night I had horrible, horrible nightmares. And what kind of cured it was one year my dad decided, I think you're grown up enough that we can watch a scary movie. And we watched the original Nosferatu on Halloween night that was being broadcast on TV. And I loved it. And I realized, hey, this could actually be kind of fun. And it helped in terms of dealing with when I encountered nightmares. My nightmares were not as intimidating because, in fact, there were things about being scared that could be more exciting. So that was the early on part of it. Since then, I've just continued to be fascinated by it. And when I went into folklore, it's all over the place in there. It's all entrenched in many, many different areas. Does the US have an equivalent of the Loch Ness Monster? There are multiple places that claim lake monsters in there. And again, was this just because the Loch Ness Monster was a familiar thing and places wanted their own regional claim on it? Does it actually come from people's sightings? There's definitely a lot of dispute. That's part of the fascination and fun with cryptids is they're, just like legends, they're kind of debates about truth and the range of that. And so you have uh, you have Champ on Lake Champlain, and Ogopogo, and Chessie again is another sort of lake monster, although it's in a bay. So there are a good number of those floating around in there. History or story behind the Bloody Mary mirror game? Boy, there there are examples of that show up definitely into the early 20th century. There are lots of weird variations of it. So, for example, in the Indiana and Chicago area, back in, I think, about the 1980s or 90s, folklorists who were looking at this found that young people who knew this almost always called her Mary Worth, which is kind of funny because Mary Worth was this sort of busybody character in the comics out there. And there are lots and lots of different permutations of how that's done, lots of permutations about exactly what's supposed to happen in the mix of it. So again, a fascinating one that people interact with. Are we getting harder to scare with all the horror films and literature available nowadays? Good question. I think we keep finding more and more creative ways to scare ourselves. The emergence of things like creepypastas definitely speaks to that. So creepypastas are this online phenomenon of people in a kind of shared, almost social media-ish setting, um, developing and adding to scary stories and narratives, and bringing in images and firsthand accounts and all of that. So it's an intentional fiction, but it's a fiction that gains a sense of greater reality to it. The most vivid example of that being Slender Man, who was tragically also associated with a murder case in Wisconsin. But I think we keep finding new ways to continue to scare ourselves. Favorite scary movies and scary books. Oh, I I I think probably my favorite scary movie is Suspiria. It's a rather gory but pretty astonishing Italian horror movie. And it draws really deeply from a lot of imagery in fairy tales, in Alice in Wonderland, but also has this kind of tale of witchcraft and magic in the modern world and very sinister things going on behind the scenes, with a very spooky soundtrack and some really astonishing visual stuff. Have you ever had an experience with a ghost? Okay, I'll give you the closest thing to that's a pretty vivid one for me. When I was in graduate school, I one summer sublet an apartment, and it was this upstairs apartment in what had been a house that was converted. So there was a retail space on the lower floor and apartments up in the top. And it turned out to be a really crummy place to live because the door would lock behind me when I would go to the shared bathroom, and I'd have to climb out on the roof to get back in, other stuff like that. But anyway, I spent a lot of time sitting out on the porch in front of there because at that point, the store below was empty. When I first moved into this place, underneath the eaves of the roof, there were these built-in storage areas. And I walked into one of them to put some stuff in, and every hair stood up. It was just that total sense of alarm, nothing particularly to trigger it. And my friend who was moving stuff with me, I backed out and I said, walk in there and tell me what you encounter. And he said the same thing. He was like, something's really creepy there. I don't know what's going on. So I avoided going into that side of stuff, lived out the summer in the rest of the place, went on, moved on to other places. 2 years later, I was doing a project for a class and doing something on Tibetan food in the United States. And the wife of the Dalai Lama's brother, who lived in the community, had recently opened a Tibetan restaurant in that retail space that was below where I had stayed. She didn't know that I had stayed there. I didn't initially make the connection. And then when I was interviewing her about her experiences opening the restaurant, she said, when we first moved in here, on that one side of the restaurant, something terrible had happened. You'd walk over there and just everything, you had a horrible sensation, things would fall down. It was awful. So we brought in the monks, we had the monks chant, we did, had rituals that went on in there, we gave offerings, and then I sat down and I decided to have a conversation with whoever's there. And I said, look, I want to make this a nice place. I want to make this a really beautiful place. Wouldn't you rather live in a nice and beautiful place? And ultimately, then nothing further happened. Everything was tranquil in that side. And then I told her that I had actually had that experience with the upstairs, and she laughed. She said that didn't surprise her in the least. So that was my closest encounter with something like a ghost. Popularity of Halloween in America. That's a good question. I mean, there are lots and lots of things that seem to play into there. A lot of folklorists early on talked about how Halloween had this great kind of quality of an inversion for many years. So it was the day when kids kind of got to take over. Kids would get to dress up, take on other identities, go around from house to house and demand candy from strangers and friends and other people out there. And if they weren't given the candy, they could go out and commit pranks. And so it was an interesting kind of twist. And that all sort of changed after the whole poisoning scare of the 1980s, when everybody was convinced that their neighbors were trying to kill their kids and were x-raying candy, and massive amounts of x-rays that turned out not really to turn up anything. But that really shifted stuff. It shifted the tone in a lot of ways. And I think we've only recently kind of seen things shifting back to more of a somewhat kid-focused area, from being a more adult-focused and group Halloween event-focused thing. Scary Lady in the White Dress. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good one though. It's a really interesting thing to kind of investigate. There's even on the flip side of it, there's actually an entire website that's devoted to books from the 1960s and 1970s that have women in white dresses running away from houses on the cover of it. So something about that white dress thing, whether it's for the actual scary character or for the person who's kind of threatened in the situation, it's definitely evocative. But yeah, I don't know a specific origin to it. Hadn't heard the thing about the werewolf man in the Grand Marais area, but I love that. I'd love to learn more about that particular one. So thank you for letting me know. I think I think there are a lot of weird things out there in this world. I think there are a lot of claims that are also sort of sketchy. I think there are a lot of fun ways that people engage with these things and a lot of serious ways that people engage with these things. Uh, so I like to maintain a kind of friendly skepticism, being wary, but at the same time very much trying to listen to people and hear what folks describe in their own experiences, and to take people's accounts of their own experiences seriously. Light as a feather, stiff as a board. That's a great one. There's actually a wonderful book that came out a couple of years ago by two folklorists on folk illusions for this exact kind of category of things. Light as a feather, stiff as a board is a whole part of that, or the things that mysteriously make your arms rise up, or all sorts of things that connect with how the body functions and how we operate as beings with weight that can be spread around with many people, and how they get kind of ritualized as well, what goes around it, because a lot of them have that almost magical component to them where you take something that's a basic cool effect and make it into much more of an eerie experience. So thank you for bringing that one up. Ouija phenomenon, especially for young women, 80s and onwards. Yeah, I think a lot of people got really kind of attracted to that. Certainly, you see it showing up in t-shirts, in tattoos, in iconography all over the place. Um, Etsy brought about an explosion in handcrafted spirit boards of all sorts, and so there's definitely a lot of stuff in there. And maybe for young women, since that kind of connection in there, uh, maybe that's got a lot of the same sort of resonance as why women were especially attracted to spiritualism in the first place. That there's that possibility of access and connection that's not always there through more institutional modes of, connecting with the mysterious or the spiritual. So I think that's an intriguing one. Why is Bigfoot always blurry in photos? Good question. I, I do not have a good answer for you on that. Are exorcisms real? Exorcisms are a fascinating topic because there are so many different kinds of approaches to them. I think that the movie The Exorcist was such an iconic thing in so many ways and so chilling for people. It was so startling. It used a child character in a way that people couldn't deal with effectively. So people were literally throwing up in aisles and running out of the place. And that level of intensity um, was very meaningful for a lot of people. And Erica Brady, a folklorist who did a lot of work on the occupational folklore of ministers, talked with a bunch of Protestant ministers who were working in the days when that came out, who all of a sudden had people coming to them asking for exorcisms. And, as Protestant ministers, they never had anything on there. I think mainline Protestant folks, this wasn't anything they dealt with. And so some of them kind of said, yeah, I don't know. Some of them would refer people to priests, Catholic priests. Some of them would make up something, just thinking, okay, this will make you comforted. That would be great. Uh, I think really traumatic things happen. And I think there's such a long history of that you see a host of different traditions in lots and lots of different religions and parts of the world for how something like an exorcism could happen. And the Tibetan model for it is very different from the Catholic official model of it. And the Catholic model is very different from the evangelical model that you tend to see. Uh, I was talking with a colleague here who was saying that he really finds that with Catholic exorcisms, the first presumption is let's rule out everything else it could be. So let's figure out, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? No, no, no. Well, then maybe it might be demonic. And the evangelical take on it tends to be, yup, it's demons. Now let's deal with it. So a lot of interesting cultural assumptions go into how an exorcism happens or why an exorcism happens. Psychology behind the need to purposely scare ourselves at Halloween. I don't know. Again, I touched on a few of those things in there. There's certainly something like the classic notion of catharsis from drama, where if you're in a setting that is arguably safe, okay, that it's controlled in a way that, say, scaring yourself by running through a particularly dangerous street at night might not be. Um, to be able to be scared in that safer way gives you some of that same excitement, all those sorts of physical elements that we talked about, lets you deal with some of that as well, and then lets you kind of laugh afterwards, lets you be safe afterwards, lets you reconnect with people afterwards. So I think that's a big factor in it. Scary movie recommendations. Well, I mentioned Suspiria. The Japanese movie Hausu is terrific. The original Nosferatu is fascinating, and the remake that Werner Herzog did was I thought pretty terrific. Um, I like some of Val Lewton's ones. So the Seventh Victim, for example, is a terrific one. Fear of the monster is really a kind of desire. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, monster theory and monster culture is just such a huge area right now. All kinds of intriguing stuff. And I think there's there's that notion of we tend to wind up with monsters that are serving something we particularly want. So I think that fear of the monster is really a kind of desire, is an intriguing thing in there. Um, Certainly you see that woven into some of the, especially some of the film depictions that are out there, vampires being the classic one in there. You start out, especially from Dracula onwards, or from Camilla before then, you have this whole tradition of a weird kind of both terror and unbelievable level of attraction and draw that both are in that same kind of connection. And so I think we see some of that showing up in potentially other kinds of monsters as well. Current monster and cryptid tales reflecting societal fears. I don't know. It's hard to say, because I think that some of that for the cryptids comes from more of a place of fear, but I think a lot of cryptids have kind of been adopted in a less fearful way. Now, some of them, I mean, you definitely read through some of the accounts in there, and there's some scary stuff that's associated with people's descriptions of Mothman, for example. But at the same time, I think the way that people have connected with them sort of starts from almost more of a fandom kind of way. So they've almost adopted them the way that they've adopted movie monsters or science fiction characters or things like that, except that they're in real places and you can actually go visit those places. And there's always that chance that maybe you might run into them out there. So I think that adds an extra level of excitement. All right, a lot of questions there. Thank you for those.
Thank you. I think we made it through all of those. So
Outstanding.
fantastic. Great job. Thank you so much to our audience, for everyone who submitted a question or comment. Those are fantastic. A special thank you to our presenter, Dr. Peter Harle, for sharing his research on all things monsters, myths, and legends. I think we're all leaving inspired to learn a little bit more about cryptids, maybe watch a few scary movies this week. So thank you for that. Well, this is the end of our event, but not the end of our series. Our next event in the Dark Reflections series will be Mostly Dead is Still Slightly Alive, Premature Burial, Dracula, and the Rise of the Cremation Movement. That will be held on November 1st. You can find more information about this and other presentations by visiting our website at z.umn.edu/darkreflections. So thank you again to everyone for joining us, and I'm wishing you all a lovely Halloween.